This is a Socialist News and Views special interview.
I'm Nick Schillingford, coming to you from the Urban Cabin Studios in South Minneapolis with this special interview. On Socialist News and Views, we let folks introduce themselves. Do you want to just tell the audience who you are?
Sure. So my name's Eleanor Frisch, and for my job, I'm of counsel at Cohen Milstein Sellers Toll, which is a plaintiffs class action law firm. And I represent plaintiffs in class actions involving their retirement and health benefits. But I also do have experience in a variety of other areas of law, including civil rights, wage and hour, consumer protection. For example, I have represented people for claims under the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, and other civil rights laws like the Family and Medical Leave Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Civil Rights Act, consumer protection laws like the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I've represented people under Title IX, which is the civil rights law that protects people in schools, and claims under the First Amendment for politically motivated terminations, an apropos topic right now as well. But I'm also a person with a disability. So back in 2017, when my legal career was really just sort of getting off the ground, I developed an immunological condition called mast cell activation disorder. And I also quite possibly have additional autoimmune diseases as well that I'm still being evaluated for. And this just really opened my eyes to the oppression people with disabilities experience in our society. So after that, I became one of the founding board members of the Minnesota Disability Bar Association, which it was only the second state bar association in the country for lawyers with disabilities. But of course, any views I express here are 100% my own personal views and not the views of any organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on. This year will be the 35th anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, that you mentioned. I kind of picked that because I think it's one of the ones that people are most familiar with. FMLA, that's another one you mentioned that I think people are, relatively familiar with, especially when they have to, care for immediate family with that are ill. But yeah, as far as the ADA and other accommodations, last year, Senator Tammy Duckworth said, quote, "The disability community cannot afford another 4 years of Trump," end quote. Well, we have Trump in office now. Can you talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act in general, how it's been used in the past? And are there things that the Trump administration can do to interfere with the ADA? I mean, he's been really pushing the envelope. Are there other disability rights or accommodations that are part of the law that he could mess with in some way? So yeah, would you be willing to talk about both of those?
Yeah, so before I answer your last question, I think it's helpful to give a little bit of background on the ADA. So it was signed into law in 1990. And I think that in itself is pretty remarkable. So let's think about that for a minute. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1965 to protect people from discrimination in the private sector based on race, sex, religion, or national origin. And it took another 25 years before the federal government passed any kind of law to prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in the private sector.
Right.
And before that, people with disabilities basically had no protections. The Constitution's Equal Protection Clause really doesn't protect people with disabilities at all. If a law is passed that discriminates against people of color, for example, the Supreme Court will apply what's known as strict scrutiny to examine whether it's constitutional. And strict scrutiny basically means the court's going to be super skeptical of that law, and it will almost always be overturned. If a law is passed that discriminates against people based on their sex, the court will apply what's known as intermediate scrutiny to decide whether it's constitutional. And that means the court will still be pretty skeptical of the law, and it will usually be overturned in most situations. But if a law is passed that discriminates against people based on having a disability, the court only applies what's called rational basis review to determine if that law violates the Equal Protection Clause. And rational basis review is basically almost no review at all. It basically just asks, was there a reason that relates to a legitimate government interest? So a law discriminating against people with disabilities will almost always survive that test.
Wow.
So aside from the virtually non-existent protections provided by the Constitution, before the ADA, there were almost no protections. There was another law called the Rehabilitation Act that was passed in 1973. And that was what the ADA was based on. And the Rehabilitation Act was the first major federal law that protected people with disabilities from discrimination, but it only applies to federal employees and employment by federal contractors or to programs that receive federal financial assistance. So even the Rehabilitation Act, years after the Civil Rights Act it was passed, it took a lot of work to get that passed. Nixon vetoed the law twice before it was passed. And part of the reason the law got passed was just angry people with disabilities being activists, right? So a woman named Judy Heumann, who had polio and used a wheelchair, hosted a sit-in on Madison Avenue, and eventually Nixon signed the law, but it was pretty toothless. So a few years later, again, in 1977, Judy Heumann staged another sit-in outside a federal building in San Francisco. And I think to this day, that still holds the record for the longest occupation of a federal building in the US as part of a protest. So it was as a result of that they issued these robust regulations under the Rehabilitation Act. So it was a huge fight just to get protections for federal employees in the first place. And then for more than 15 years, we had protections for federal employees, but there were zero protections for people with disabilities in the private sector. And when I say zero protections, I mean both in employment and in public accommodations. So private businesses didn't have to be accessible. They didn't have to accommodate people with disabilities. And so an employer could just choose not to hire someone with a disability simply because they had a disability, even if the disability would have had no effect on that person's ability to work. So that was the state of the law until 1990, which is relatively recent. Then finally, in the 1990, the ADA was signed by President George H.W. Bush. It prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities, and it defines disability pretty broadly to include basically any physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what kind of protections does the ADA provide? Let's talk about that. So I think it can sort of be divided into three categories. First, it prohibits discrimination against qualified employees with disabilities. And qualified means that the employee can perform the essential job duties of the position. And it also defines discrimination against an employee to include failing to provide a reasonable accommodation to an employee with a disability. But if providing an accommodation imposes an undue burden on the employer is off the hook. How do you define what an undue burden is? Well, basically any significant expense or difficulty can be held to be an undue burden. So the court will look at things like how big is the employer, what are its business needs, and it will decide, is the cost of the accommodation too significant for the employer to provide that to the employee? So the second area the ADA protects people is it requires that public facilities and businesses provide reasonable accommodations and make their buildings accessible to people with disabilities. And that also includes requiring the removal of architectural barriers that limit access for people with disabilities. So before the ADA, you would basically almost never see a wheelchair ramp or a door opener, for example. And now under the ADA, facilities have to remove architectural barriers wherever it is readily achievable. And it also requires that these goods and services be provided in an integrated setting, so you can't just segregate people with disabilities. So finally, the ADA also requires that state and local governments provide equal access to programs, services, and activities. So this would require that state and local governments make, for example, public education and transportation accessible to people with disabilities. And that would also apply to healthcare and social services provided by state or local governments. So let's talk a little bit more about the ADA. It instructs the Attorney General to promulgate regulations that implement the statute. And the Attorney General promulgated this really important regulation that says a public entity has to administer disability care in the most integrated setting appropriate. So this is a really important development in the history of the ADA. Relying on that regulation, there's this landmark Supreme Court decision called Olmstead, where the Supreme Court said, you have to put people with disabilities in community care settings rather than isolate them into institutions. So unless community-based treatment isn't appropriate, you have to put them in a community setting. And that is why we now see people with cognitive disabilities are provided care in group homes in their communities rather than in these big mental health institutions. Things used to be really, really bad for people with severe cognitive or mental impairments who were put in institutions. They were basically subjected to torture. And the ADA changed that. So this is one of the biggest strides the ADA made because of that Olmstead case. And that Olmstead case, again, it partly looked to this regulation I mentioned that says you have to provide, you have to integrate.
Right.
And that regulation was promulgated in 1991 by the George H.W. Bush administration as well.
I think that's a super important part. I mean, the fact they should not segregate, because I could easily see employers being like, oh yeah, we have employees with disabilities. They're in this building across town that's like, run down, and you can get in there, but it's not where, it's not where you'd want to work. I could easily see, private employers segregating people if that wasn't part of the law. So that's super important. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Yeah, no, private employers and, the government, because a lot of people with disabilities are reliant on government provided assistance. And so for many years, people with disabilities, especially people with severe cognitive problems, were just basically isolated and locked up in these institutions as though they were in prison. They were basically incarcerated and subject to the most horrible conditions you could possibly imagine. So you ask, what can the Trump administration do to interfere with the ADA? That's such an interesting question, and it really got me thinking. So before I answer that, I want to back up a little bit again.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really interesting that both of the federal laws that protect people with disabilities, the main ones, the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act that I mentioned, they were both signed into law by Republican presidents. Republican presidents who really believed in the free market. And that's apparent when you look at the laws. Like, they prohibit discrimination and require reasonable accommodations, but only if it isn't too much trouble or too expensive for the business.
Right.
And what that really does, if you think about it, is it provides this route for people with disabilities to participate in the labor market rather than be reliant on government welfare, while also ensuring businesses don't have to spend more money than the value of the disabled employee's labor would justify. So if you think about it, none of this exactly undermines free market ideals. And so it's not surprising that Republican presidents signed these laws. So in the same vein, what does it mean that someone with disabilities must receive community-based treatment rather than being institutionalized? Well, it means they can participate in the free market, right? They can go to the store, they can buy things, they can be consumers, and they can hold part-time jobs. They can be part of the means of production. Historically, when these laws were passed, mental institutions were state-run institutions. So if people with disabilities were segregated in these big government-run institutions, they were essentially entirely reliant on the government. So the regulation that requires they be integrated with the community, that's also kind of in line with capitalist goals, if you think about it. So, but now we're seeing some changes that I think put that framework in jeopardy. And part of that relates to the privatization of institutions such as prisons that we've been seeing. And for example, institutions that will detain immigrants. There's a shift toward the privatization of these institutions. And so I have concerns that that is creating incentives to change the law related to the institutionalization of people with disabilities, because now there would be this opportunity to really profit off of that industry. And so let's talk about that important case called Olmstead. That case that relied on the George H.W. Bush era regulation that says you can't institutionalize people with disabilities. They need to be integrated in a community setting. Well, now that we're seeing more and more privatization of institutions for people with disabilities, like I said, there's this opportunity for private corporations to make a bunch of money off of this. And at the same time, the legal foundation of that Olmstead decision is on pretty fragile ground right now. So that part of the ADA the language of the ADA there doesn't specifically require community integration, though the regulation does. You might have heard about this, but in June 2024, the Supreme Court issued a decision called Loper-Bright, a really important decision in the law that I think a lot of lay people don't understand the importance of this decision. It overturned the doctrine of deference to regulations that interpret ambiguous statutes. So now it's really not clear what effect that case is going to have on this Olmstead decision that prevents people with disabilities from being isolated in institutions.
Give a little more on what that did. I guess I still don't fully understand what it did.
The Loper-Bright decision?
Yeah.
Oh, so before Loper-Bright, there was this doctrine known as the Chevron doctrine that said when the court is interpreting a statute and the language of the law is ambiguous, the court will defer to the interpretations issued by federal agencies about what that law means.
Right, gotcha.
So that would include, for example, regulations that are issued that interpret a law such as the ADA, including that regulation that talks about how you have to integrate people with disabilities.
Gotcha.
So it sort of threatens the foundation of that Olmstead decision that was this really important landmark decision in disability rights. Now, I personally
it threatens other regulations too, potentially, right? A lot of other areas where this stuff has been interpreted by these agencies.
Absolutely, all kinds of regulations.
Yep.
And that can be, depending on who issued the regulation and whether you like it or not.
Right.
It can be a good thing or a bad thing. There are definitely some arguments I can think of that could persuade the current Supreme Court, which, as you know, is very conservative, to overturn this landmark ADA decision that is really one of the only things standing in the way of people with cognitive disabilities and other serious disabilities from being institutionalized like they used to be decades ago. I don't want to say what those arguments are because I don't want to give them.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So what other threats can the Trump administration make to disability rights? Well, the Trump administration could change that regulation. They have the authority to do that. They could literally just change that regulation to say, oh, the ADA doesn't actually require community-based treatment. You can institutionalize people with disabilities willy-nilly, regardless of their specific needs. I don't know what the court would do with that, but it might not go well for people with disabilities. So I have hopes that Olmstead will survive, but it's certainly under threat right now. What about disability discrimination in private and public employment and schools and universities? What can Trump do there? Well, let's talk about DEI programs designed to help people with disabilities. Trump has recently made it pretty clear that he does not approve of DEI initiatives to help people with disabilities. Shortly after he was inaugurated, we had the first deadly midair collision in decades when a plane collided with that Army helicopter. And what was the first thing out of President Trump's mouth? He blamed the FAA's DEI program. And specifically, he blamed people with disabilities without any basis, in fact, because let's face it, he hates people with disabilities. I feel really comfortable saying that because he's openly ableist. He uses the term mentally disabled as an insult. He openly mocks people with disabilities. His nephew, Fred Trump, has a child with a disability. And Fred said that when he went to the White House in 2020 to discuss issues related to people with severe disabilities with his uncle, Trump told him, the shape they're in, all the expenses, maybe those kinds of people should just die. So Trump's personal view is that people with disabilities should just die because they're too expensive. So anyway, I got a little bit off track there, but now that Trump's back in office, he's issued an executive order against DEI programs in the federal government. And also, that executive order threatens potential legal action against private companies for their DEI programs. And that's really had an impact. Like, we can already see the impact of that just based on what I've seen about this issue in the news. It seems like most private companies are scrapping their DEI programs, or at least renaming them.
Right.
So Target, for example, got rid of its DEI program and created an alternative program called Belonging to the Bullseye. It's actually ridiculous if you think about it. And it's ridiculous how quickly companies are jumping in line to comply with what I see as a largely unenforceable executive order. Because my personal view is most of these DEI programs, a lot of which focus on providing equal opportunities for people of color, for example, these programs are generally not illegal. So most of them don't involve like direct affirmative action. And I don't think the Trump administration would necessarily win most of these lawsuits if they decided to sue corporations for their DEI programs. But there were some of these programs that did actually involve direct affirmative action. For example, I know from personal experience that a lot of law firms provided special job openings limited to diverse law students to come on as summer associates. And I thought those programs were great. But under the existing law, under existing Supreme Court precedent, the Supreme Court has made it pretty clear affirmative action based on race, sex is illegal. The Supreme Court would almost certainly find that illegal under the Constitution if a public actor did it, and illegal under Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, if a private actor did it. So, but what does that mean for people with disabilities? Well, first off, most DEI programs don't really actually focus on disability. So according to a survey from 2021, 90% of companies claim to prioritize diversity, but only 4% consider disability as part of their DEI initiatives. And it's actually pretty ironic because it would be almost impossible for a DEI initiative focused on disability to run afoul of the law, even if it involved affirmative action. So it's interesting. Disability is fundamentally different from other protected statuses under the law. Title VII, for example, the Civil Rights Act, that would protect a white, straight man from being discriminated against because of his race, sexual orientation, or gender. But the ADA and the Rehabilitation Act only protect people who have disabilities. They don't protect people who are able-bodied. There's no federal statute that protects people for being abled or for not having a disability. So, and like I said before, the Constitution doesn't really protect them either. Disability status has almost no protection under the Equal Protection Clause, and the same would be true of able-bodied status. So if there was a state law that discriminated against people for being abled, it would be subject to rational basis review by the courts, which, like I said before, is really almost no review at all. So in my view, there's really nothing Donald Trump can do about DEI initiatives for people with disabilities. There's no law his administration could sue a company under for favoring or giving preference to people with disabilities. And the president cannot create legislation. He can't just create law by writing an executive order. That is a fundamental principle of the separation of powers. And of course, the ADA, like I said before, it requires people with disabilities to be provided with special accommodations. So if a corporation gets rid of its DEI programs that ensure accessibility and accommodations, it may find itself running afoul of the law for doing that. So in a nutshell, DEI for disabilities, go for it. You're golden. Trump might not like it, but I don't think he can stop it, at least not under the law as it currently stands. He might have some control, sadly, over how the executive branch promotes disability inclusion within the federal workforce, but that's pretty much it. And affirmative action for people with disabilities, I don't see any basis in law for that being illegal. You can post a job and say only people with disabilities can apply, and there's really no law to stop you from doing that. So in this sense, I think Trump is really limited in what he can do in that area, which I'm thankful for.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he mostly uses, fear and I think private companies' interest in just scrapping potential interest in just scrapping this stuff so they don't have to do it anymore as his, driving force to get things done. He's not necessarily the thing is, they have all these branches of government, so they could go through the, legal process of like new laws and stuff like that to do this stuff, but he's not doing it that way because he likes to use his, his position and his fact that he's on TV, can be on all the media, gets covered all the time. Again, just to kind of make people afraid, basically. I think
that's right. And I think he would have a lot of trouble getting some of the legislation he would like to see in the line of Project 2025 type legislation passed. Like some of the more moderate Republicans might not be on board with that. So that is one reason why he's doing it like this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you hinted at it some in what you were saying before, but I want to talk a little bit about, how we should view disability oppression. I know that you and I have discussed a little bit about some theorists behind this. I've read a little bit of their stuff, but definitely not as much as you. Marta Russell was mentioned before. What are your thoughts on kind of how we could improve the laws or more generally our society, so that everyone in our society is able to live a dignified life? How do we, laws or just the way we think about things, I guess, or both?
Yeah. So thinking about your question, I think before we get into that, it's helpful to just think about, in a very basic sense, what it even means to be disabled. Our society consists of people with a spectrum of capabilities, both cognitive and physical. Mm-hmm. So where is that cutoff line that determines when someone has a disability and what forces create that status? And there are several theories on this. So disability has traditionally been viewed as a pathological state. You have a disability if you have a medical condition, and that is a defect within the individual and the individual's body or mind. The problem lies in the body or mind of the people with disabilities, and that's what's known as the medical model of disability. But if you think about it, this model of disability, it doesn't make sense. So I can have a medical condition and not be disabled by it. And whether a medical condition is disabling depends on the context. So like take vision issues, for example. Before the invention of eyeglasses, having poor vision was extremely disabling. You would have trouble foraging, hunting, caring for kids, etc. But all it took was society putting a lens in front of that person's eyes and the problem was solved. So now we don't think of people who wear glasses as disabled. So what forces are really at work that really make a person disabled? Well, in the 70s and the 80s, disability activists came up with a new model of disability that I think is a lot better than the medical model, and it's called the social model of disability. Under this model, it's society that disables us. So disability derives from a mismatch between the person with a disability and their environment. So let me give you a concrete example. Take a person who uses a wheelchair. They're disabled in that they're unable to climb stairs. But who chose to design buildings with multiple levels? And who chose to connect those levels with stairs instead of ramps? Someone made a choice to do that, to exclude people in wheelchairs from accessing those levels. Society did that. Society could have chosen to build single level buildings, or it could have chosen to connect those upper stories with ramps instead of stairs. But instead, it set a threshold for disability that included the ability to climb stairs as a cutoff line. So, but even that, and this is where we get into Marta Russell's work, even that doesn't fully explain what makes someone disabled, because why did society decide to put stairs in buildings instead of using ramps? I think there's a pretty clear answer. Stairs take up less space and they use less material. Stairs are cheaper. So if I'm a business owner, it's probably more profitable to design a building with stairs and give up whatever small amount of revenue I might have received from allowing people in wheelchairs to be able to frequent my business. So this is where Marta Russell's work comes in. Marta Russell was an amazing disability activist. She had cerebral palsy, and later in life, she eventually became dependent on Social Security benefits, and that really radicalized her in a good way. She became really focused on how capitalism shapes who is considered disabled and how capitalism shapes the oppression people with disabilities face. And she developed what's known as the money model of disability, which has received very little attention, but which I think is really important. So we're going to get a little bit into Marxist theory here.
Yeah. That's good.
Marta Russell said, disability is a classification of people who are deemed less exploitable or not exploitable by the owning class who controls the means of production in a capitalist economy. So the prevailing rate of exploitation of labor determines who is or is not disabled. So because what makes someone valuable in a capitalist society is their ability to produce surplus labor. So surplus labor, i.e., they cost less to employ than the value produced by their labor. Surplus labor is how the people who control the means of production make a profit. The person they're employing produces more value than the cost of that person's labor. And someone is disabled if they can't produce that surplus labor at the market rate. So they either produce less, so their production is worth less than their wages would be at the market rate, or they cost more to employ than the value of what they produce because of the expenses associated with their disability, like accommodations or their health insurance, for example. So under this money model of disability, someone is disabled when they can no longer produce that surplus labor at the same level as other members of society, and that makes them less valuable in a capitalist system. So what happens to these people under the money model of disability? Well, first of all, in a capitalist economy, they necessarily become impoverished. So since they have no value as producers in the economic order, the government provides them welfare that is basically near or below the poverty level. This really holds true today in our society. If you're disabled to the point that you've never been able to produce surplus labor, i.e., you've never been able to work, the only income you can get basically from the federal government is supplemental security income, or SSI. And the maximum monthly payment in 2024 for SSI was $943 per month. Can you imagine living on that?
Yeah.
It is well below the poverty level.
Oh, yeah.
The recognized poverty level.
I mean, when you look at, like, I was just looking at housing, I was just looking at a chart in this film yesterday about housing costs and wages or whatever. And it was like this: housing costs were like skyrocketing and wages were staying the same. And if you think about that with benefits, almost nobody ever even compares benefits and these costs and stuff like that. And it's even worse than wages, which have slightly increased in a lot of places, but very slightly.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really not keeping up.
No.
Over time. If you were lucky enough to be able to work at some point in your life and you later become disabled, you might be entitled to another federal monthly income called Social Security disability insurance. But that's different because it really is like a type of insurance. You've been paying money out of your wages to be entitled to that. Yeah, and so people with disability actually also have to spend more money to obtain the same standard of living as someone without a disability. So they have to pay for things like personal assistance services, out-of-pocket healthcare costs, pre-prepared meals, special diets, accessible housing, which is typically more expensive. So the poverty level for someone with a disability should actually be an even higher threshold than for everyone else, but instead they end up getting paid well below the standard poverty level for everyone. Right. So what else happens when someone can no longer work because of their disability and they can't provide that surplus labor? Since they can't produce surplus labor, their sole value to a capitalist economy is their value as consumers. And as a result, people with disabilities become commodified by the system. Instead of being part of the means of production, they're commodified. They're put into nursing homes or institutions so that corporations can profit off of their Medicare or Medicaid dollars and their Social Security income, or their government health benefits and what little income they receive through Social Security goes toward paying for accommodations, personal assistance, takeout food, group homes. For example, since the Olmstead decision I was talking about that says you have to provide community-based care, that moved a lot of people from big government-run institutions into group homes within the community. There's now an entire industry that's formed around group homes designed to profit off of basically the Social Security income and Medicaid dollars of people with disabilities. And there's also a whole industry surrounding providing expensive products to allow people with disabilities to live just normal lives. Like quality wheelchairs, for example, incredibly expensive, way more expensive than they should be, and often not covered by insurance. So the ADA doesn't prevent any of this. It doesn't allow people with disabilities to escape this trap of capitalism. It's designed to make it easier to route people with disabilities into one of the two channels of profit, the labor market or the consumer market. And like I explained before, it was passed by Republican administration. It's not some radical statute. It really was designed to further capitalist ideals. And employers aren't required to provide an accommodation unless it would impose an undue hardship. They don't have to provide an accommodation if it's so expensive that they could no longer derive that surplus labor from the disabled employee. So the right to an accommodation is subject to this cost-benefit analysis in service of capitalism. And in some ways, particularly in the context where unemployment's low and there isn't a lot of reserve labor, the right to an accommodation isn't very meaningful. The forces of capitalism would have provided that accommodation anyway, because the employer can derive more value from the disabled employee than it has to pay for that accommodation. And so for that reason, Marta Russell was really highly critical of the ADA. And I think she was spot on. If you look at the statistics, the ADA actually didn't significantly increase the overall employment rate for people with disabilities. In fact, some people think it actually hurt people and reduced employment opportunities because employers perceive the cost of accommodation to be too high. And then, of course, there's that cost that they're going to have to pay for that employee's health insurance as well. That's always there in the background. So it's cheaper to hire someone who doesn't have a disability. So it would really only make economic sense to hire an employee with a disability if unemployment is really low and you need to tap into reserve labor. Reserve labor being that pool of people who are unemployed but willing to work. Yet at the same time, like since the passage of the ADA, we're seeing people also denied Social Security benefits because, oh, well, now that the ADA is around, your disability can be accommodated by employers. So like you may have a disability that prevents you from working, but it can be accommodated. So now you can't get your Social Security benefits. So the ADA actually made it harder for some people to access those benefits. So what the ADA did do is it ensured that there's this additional reserve of labor in our economy of people with disabilities who are unemployed that can be tapped into if it benefits the people who own the means of production to do so. And the bigger the pool of reserve labor, the less negotiating power employees have. So in many ways, the ADA really benefited the capitalist order. There has basically been no significant increase in real wages since 1990. Meanwhile, productivity has gone way up. So the value of production has skyrocketed since 1990. Where is all that value going? It's not going to people's real wages.
No.
Who's benefiting from that? It's going to the people at the top. And I think that the ADA is really helps that system work that way. Rather than really providing protections for people with disabilities, I really do think that at least the employment provisions of the ADA largely just help further the capitalist world order. So in case it wasn't clear, I mostly agree with Marta Russell on this one.
Right.
The ADA may be better than nothing, but it hasn't done all that much to advance the employment of people with disabilities.
In the theory, is it surplus labor or surplus value that the framing of the piece? I don't know if you, but anyway.
So surplus labor is basically the amount of extra labor you can provide that that will produce surplus value beyond the value of your wages.
Got it. Yeah. So I just wanted to go back to the stairs and ramps piece real quick to say one thing. It's like, if you think about it, like in a factory situation, or like here around me, there's like grain silos and Archer Daniels Midland, and the trains come in and get the grain. Another thing that takes up even less space is a ladder, and takes even less requirements. And then there's certain people that may not be able to easily climb up a really long ladder to another floor or even multiple floors. All of a sudden, they have a disability now, right? Based on that. So it really kind of highlights how the environment is the thing that's creating that, because somebody that could, go upstairs, they're not going to be able to go up this. They're not going to be able to go up this ladder. And then I just, talking about myself, I have ADHD. I was treated for, with medication for it in high school. That was really helpful at that time in high school. And then I went off medication. And then I was struggling probably, but I was achieving the things, I guess, that I was setting out to achieve for a long time. And then in 2021, working as a nurse, I basically, kind of had a complete breakdown, or I was not able to function within my environment anymore at that point. And so I had to seek additional resources and medication and other things to be able to participate in the things that I needed to be participating in. And I probably should have done it a lot sooner, I realized, after I did it. But it was strange how I didn't have a lot of insight into my condition when I was experiencing it. And then when I was seeking some kind of treatment, then I was starting to say, okay, I probably should have been doing this a long time ago. And so this was kind of like building up, to not being able to function within my environment. So that was kind of an interesting experience to kind of, see how this stuff can happen, and how, and I didn't even really think about ADHD as a disability as such, even though it's extremely disabling in the current society that we find ourselves in. And then,
it's interesting because ADHD is disabling, but I think people, with ADHD also have things to offer that people without ADHD don't have. Like, people with ADHD, their brains think differently, and that's valuable. Our society should place value on that.
I agree with you. Yeah. And that's why I said disabling in our society, because I find lots of great things to do that I find rewarding and enriching daily, but they don't really pay the bills, so to speak, and they don't function to generate lots of value for Elon Musk and all the other people at the top that are trying to skim off apparently billions. I saw something, his wealth, his value his wealth had increased by like 100 and something billion over some like really short period of time. And it's just mind blowing when all of us are struggling so much. I feel like there was one more thing I wanted to say, but yeah, most people don't think about this. Oh yeah, I was going to say, I work with assisted living houses in community that are set up very much like group homes. And yeah, the amount of things that people have to pay for out of pocket from what little amount of money that they're getting is just, it's maddening every day. And just I was trying to get somebody a medication the other day, and the insurance won't cover it. And it's like $300 out of pocket. And I'm like, oh, just kidding. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. So then, then the provider just has to not prescribe that needed medication. So it's really frustrating every day to have to deal with the system.
I mean, that's just sort of the natural result of having this capitalist healthcare system where people are focused on profits rather than focused on helping people get better.
Yeah, it's really disgusting. And
I'm glad there's a lot of attention being paid to that right now.
I hope so. I'm glad as well. And and just the fact, like you said, that there's really been very little changes since the 90s, in a positive way, or like with increasing benefits or anything like that. And it's like, we know how expensive stuff has become just over the last like couple of years, let alone since the 90s. It's just really, it should make everyone a Marxist or at least anti-capitalist in some form, because it's a really frustrating system, and there's so many connections to be made. Yeah, I really appreciate you speaking with me. Is there anything else that you want to cover about the idea of, disability under capitalism, or anything else that you want to mention going on right now?
Well, I guess the other thing I would say is that marginalized groups are more likely to have a disability than people who are privileged. So people of color are more likely to have a disability than white people. LGBTQ plus people are more likely to have a disability than straight cisgender people. So people living in poverty are more likely to acquire a disability. And then those disabilities often force them to remain in poverty. So I just really think that the oppression that people with disabilities experience is intricately connected to these other forms of oppression that other groups experience, including class oppression. And it's just all connected, and it's intersectional. And, by helping people with disabilities, I think we would help combat oppression on multiple levels from multiple angles.
I agree. I really appreciate you speaking with me so much. This is super important, and especially now with authoritarian and pretty disgusting person at the helm of this, who thinks of people with disabilities as less than human. So.
Yeah, it's weird to me that wasn't a deal breaker for people.
Right. Yeah.
So thank you so much for letting me be on your podcast, and thank you for the important work you're doing with this podcast as well. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Eleanor. Have a good day.
All right. Thanks.
Bye-bye. And that's our special interview. Thanks for listening. Solidarity.
This has been a Socialist News and Views special interview.